that these are the black people of Kush.
Yeah.
No, not Kush, the black people of Egypt,
Of
something
Kemet.
of Kemet. Or no, they saying the Kemet mean the black people in this whole glyph right here. But from what I've learned, that would be kind of out of context based off the culture, based off of how they would have did it. So what is this saying right here?
Well, the first part of it normally, and I'm not sure if this is actually an original writing or something that's been composed. The first three signs where you have that sort of little thing with the jagged edge, that actually represents the tail of a crocodile.
Okay.
And it has the value Kem
Okay.
in Egyptian. And then the owl is the letter M.
Okay.
And the little half circle sign, which represents a kind of loaf of bread, is T. So those first three signs, we're reading from left to right. Those first three signs represent the group Kemet. And it comes from the word Kem, which means black. So Kemet means literally that which is black. And generally speaking, this word classically refers to Egypt as being the black land. And then the three signs you have, the seated man, the seated woman, and those three strokes that look like the number one. Those three strokes together is sort of the designation for plural. So the man and the women and the three strokes would be like meaning generically people. So if you read this would look like a writing for the black people,
okay,
or those who are black, referring to a group of people. And if you wanted to write a word that meant those who are black, referring to people, this is how you would write it. The question I have is whether this is actually something that it would appear on an ancient Egyptian text, or whether this is something somebody has composed in using Egyptian hieroglyphs that is not actually from an ancient Egyptian text, but as actually somebody who has composed it using the ancient Egyptian language to write a word that the ancient Egyptians didn't write themselves. If you see what I mean, like
yes,
it's the same as if you, well, to give you sort of an example, they still use Latin in the Catholic Church, which was a language, of course, spoken by the ancient Romans. The church issued a new dictionary that contains words that the ancient Romans never used, such as a word for computer or a word that means jumbo jet, to refer to a jumbo jet aircraft. Okay. Well, obviously, the Romans didn't have words for computer and jumbo jet, but you can make a word in Latin that means such things. Now, there is an actual word in Egyptian that means the people of Egypt, but it uses the word for people, which is Romachet, and then it uses the word for Egypt, which means Kemet, and it would be Romachet and Kemet, which means the people of Egypt, which means literally the people of the black land. So again, I would have to look at dictionaries to see if I could find this particular word that's written this way. But I just wonder whether
I think it is. I think it is in a dictionary. But okay, that's it. Well, I'm not sure if you can find it actually in a sentence. So okay, yeah, I got you.
It's also possible that this is a writing that would be read the people of the black land as opposed to the black people.
Okay.
Because the word for Egypt is most often attested as Kemet, the black land.
Correct.
But the word for people, the standard word for people is Romachet.
Romesh, right? Romesh.
Yeah.
Okay. Remesh. Okay. Am I saying it wrong? Remesh.
Well, Remesh means man or person. Mm-hmm. But the plural form of Remesh, which means a man or a person, is Romachet, and that means people.
Okay. So if you was to find it I think it is in the dictionary, maybe Faulkner's dictionary. I'm not quite sure.
I actually had that dictionary. Can I just grab it real quick?
Yeah, grab it. Do your thing real quick. Yeah, grab that. We needed to figure out. Yeah, Smash, was that in the? I mean, I think I'm talking about Smash. Yeah, this is actually Smash work. Let's see. That's thesaurus. It might have found it in the thesaurus. Let me see. No.
Oh wait, I found a PDF. I have a PDF of this dictionary.
Okay.
Here. This is the fun of scholarship, is when you actually have to thumb through books just to confirm things. So it doesn't work. It doesn't work well with television and live podcasts. But
Oh.
this is what we have to do to confirm things.
Yeah, that's a good process. We need that process right there. It's fine. That works well for what we're doing. Let me see. Was it here? Oh, I see the sticks right. How are you doing it? Yeah, I see this right there. Yeah, it's definitely in Faulkner's dictionary because we did have that. I'm certain it's in Faulkner's dictionary. Hold on. Now that I think about it, hold on. I'm certain it's in Faulkner's dictionary. Let's see.
Okay, I'm at the case. Let's see. Here we go. Okay. So I'm just looking at the. So I have Kemet. Oh, here we go.
Yeah, it's in Faulkner's dictionary.
I did find it as a writing for Egyptians.
Okay.
And I think what that would mean is not necessarily, if you will, the black ones, but probably, and it's attested in a papyrus. So you have first one, the traditional writing of the word for Egypt as the Black Land.
Okay.
You do have it written as a colloquial experience for the Egyptians. And so, I mean, you could take it as meaning, those who are black, if you will.
Okay.
But it also could be taken, and I suspect this is the more likely interpretation, as those of the Black Land.
Okay.
So, I mean, again, it's a bit ambiguous. But if the standard interpretation of the word Kemet, referring to the place of Egypt, is, the Black Land,
Mm-hmm.
then this writing of referring to the people would most likely mean those who were of the Black Land rather than those who are black.
Okay, so all right.
Again, possible to interpret it either way, but in terms of the context of the word Kemet as referring to the place. And just to explain to your audience, the reason why Egypt is called the Black Land is because of the color of the soil of the fertile land of Egypt, which is, and by Egypt, the Egyptians meant the fertile Nile Valley. And this is the part of today we think of Egypt as this area that, is on the map, which also includes the desert. Which the ancient Egyptians called the Red Land, the Jasseret, and of course that was a place no plants grew. It was completely barren. Whereas the Kemet, the Black Land, this is the area that when the annual Nile flood comes and overspills its bank, during the flood, it would deposit this thick layer of muddy silt that was dark, literally black in color. And this was like liquid, potting soil. When you get that potting soil,
absolutely,
that rich black color. I mean, the Nile deposited this liquid fertilizer every year, and the soil is literally this rich black color, which is a color of fertility. It's the reason why Egypt was so bountiful for the agricultural harvest. But any seed you threw at it would grow, and so that was what they considered to be Egypt, the land of the black soil. And so that was Egypt. And once you got into the desert, you were no longer in Egypt, even if it, 5 miles from the Nile River. Technically, you were no longer in Egypt from that perspective. And so, in that sense, the people of the Black Land, I think, is those who are of the Black Land, I think, is what this word means. Now, again, you could literally interpret it those who are black, but I suspect it really means those who are of the Black Land. In other words, Egyptians.
Hey,
So-
let me add on a quick point. So the people in the Red Land, did the people from Kemet ever live also in the Red Lands?
Well, as far as I know, we don't have words a word that means like those who are of the Red Land. Now, the Red Land was essentially outside of Egypt, but the other word to express outside of Egypt was as a foreign land. It was what the Egyptians called the Hasset, which is the mountain land, the hill country. And the term the Egyptians used, the generic term for foreigner, was called Hasutiu, which literally means the mountain men, if you will, the hillbillies, those who were of the mountains, those who were of the hills. So, I mean, literally, it was kind of a denigrating term.
That's crazy.
All foreigners were generically hillbillies or mountain men.
Okay.
And hill dwellers. They also referred to, again, they were not very politically correct when it came. They were very creative in coming up with these very derogatory names for foreigners. For instance, they called Bedouin who lived in the desert, they called them those who were upon the sand, if you will, sand crawlers or sand dwellers. And then they had all kinds of specific names, both, the ethnic names for various foreign peoples who were Nubians or Libyans or Syrians. But they also used kind of very, specific derogatory names like, bowmen for Nubians or boomerang men for, Asiatics, etc. But they were to be distinguished from, again, Egyptians or, the people of Egypt, that kind of thing. Or,
okay.
Or in this case, the people of the Black Land.
Okay, so here's the actual discussion or debate that we're having in the community. What I'm wanting to know is how do you make distinctions? Because you said you could very well translate it as that. Now, what would deter you from translating it as the Black people as opposed to the people of the Black Land? And you gave a great explanation of why it would be that. So as you translate text,
yes,
what are you relying on to get the best translations that will fit the indigenous people and their mindset? What are you using to actually get the spirit of what you think they were saying?
Well, I would say it was based on the context where the usual term for Egypt is, which is consistently referred to as the Black Land. And the most common expression for the people of Egypt would be they're much more frequently referred to as the Romachet and Kemet, the people of Kemet, referring to the Black Land, or simply as just the people. For instance, this particular writing, which we just saw, if you look up in Faulkner, this dictionary, he gives you references to where the text occurs. And there's only one attestation. Now, that doesn't mean there's only one time in Egyptian history they ever used this term. But as far as we can tell, it wasn't the most common way to express the word for Egyptians. The other question is there any other evidence that they saw themselves as Black as opposed to, or how were they thinking of themselves? or how they're depicting themselves. And how are we defining ethnicity among the Egyptians as opposed to other foreign peoples? So again, in the way Egyptians depict themselves in art, they depict themselves with a variety of skin tones. Some of them are dark brown, and others are represented with this sort of reddish brown color. When you see the way they depict Nubians, for instance, sometimes they're shown with jet black skin, but they can also be shown with brown or dark brown skin. When they show people from Asia, in other words, from like what we would call Canaan or Syria, as well as Libya, they show them sometimes what we would consider to be white or Caucasian skin, but they also show them with yellow skin.
Okay.
The other thing we have to think about is that color, including skin color, also has symbolic meaning. So they're not necessarily in art showing the skin color of individuals, including also gods, by the way, in terms of what we might call, accuracy to show what somebody actually looks like, but more for symbolic reasons. So, for instance, the way that men and women are shown in Egyptian art, it is not always different, but is often different for reasons that are still debated. But for instance, very often women in Egyptian art are shown with a lighter skin tone, which again sometimes can be what essentially looks to us as quote unquote Caucasian or white, sort of a kind of beige or creamy color, but also can be shown with yellow skin. Whereas other times they can occasionally be shown with the same kind of reddish brown skin that men are commonly shown. Whereas men are uniformly shown with, darker skin tones, either with a brown colored skin or with a reddish brown skin. Now, when you see women that are shown with yellow skin, if you took that literally, you would have to conclude that there was an epidemic of cirrhosis of the liver or hepatitis, because there were all these women with yellow skin that must mean they have liver disease. Now, obviously, that's not the case. You have to conclude that yellow skin color is at the very least symbolic, but you can't take it literally. Likewise, when you see Asiatic people that are shown with yellow skin, it doesn't mean, again, that they have liver problems, but in fact, it may be symbolic of the idea that they were considered effeminate by the Egyptians. So again, skin color can also have symbolic meaning. And I think that because if you actually look at Egypt today, and I have no reason to believe this was different in ancient Egyptian times, that Egyptians have varieties of skin color. Some people are very light, some people are very dark, with every shade of color in between. Although most Egyptians are darker skinned than so-called white or Caucasian people. Although you do see people that are very pale skinned, you see people that range in color from various brown shades to people that are extremely dark skinned in Egypt. And I think and we can also see this in some ancient Egyptian mummies, as well as I say, in the modern Egyptian population. And I think basically, although there have been all kinds of different groups of people who have migrated to Egypt over the past 2,000 or 3,000 years, just the fact that when you walk around Egypt today, you will see people in Egypt that I swear look like ancient Egyptian statues. The idea that how, I've seen Ramses and Tutankhamun and Old Kingdom pharaohs walking around Egypt today and said, oh my God, that person looks like Ramses II. Oh my God, that person looks like King so-and-so from the 4th dynasty of Egypt that built a pyramid. The idea that like the ancient Egyptian population has completely disappeared from the modern bloodlines of Egypt is just nonsense. I've seen these people that look like, Old Kingdom statues and things like that. and so I have no reason to believe that the population of Egypt has changed that much. And again, these modern Egyptians, who I think are very much like their ancient ancestors, a lot of them would have come in a variety of shades of skin tone, and I think that the Egyptians chose to represent themselves in a uniform way in art, to distinguish themselves from foreign peoples. But either way, that they were kind of stereotyping themselves and other foreign peoples, sort of as a way for, stereotyped kind of identification. This is the way a Nubian is supposed to look like. This is the way an Egyptian is supposed to look like. This is the way an Asiatic is supposed to look like. This is the way a Libyan is supposed to look like, even though there was great variety among the Egyptians and probably other foreign peoples.
That was a great explanation. It was very thorough. Put my screen on there real quick. I just want Peter to take a look at this real fast. I'm not sure if you can see this text right here. It's actually entitled Ethnic Identity in the Land of the Pharaohs.
Yes.
Past, present, and approaching Egypt. Is that a good book? Because I've read that. Is that a good, would you recommend that?
Yeah, I haven't read the whole thing. It's a recent book, and I know the guy who wrote it.
Okay.
Yes, I think, it's a recent study, and he's trying, just to give some framework, and I've looked at this. One of the things that Egyptologists have been, basically fighting against and trying to get away from is that 100 years ago, I teach a course called Egyptian Historiography, where we look at how Egyptologists and how modern historians write about the ancient Egyptian past. And 100 years ago, there's no question that Egyptology 100 years ago, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, were like most of society, if not all of society, openly and blatantly racist, certainly from our perspective, although they didn't think of themselves that way. But I mean, by modern terms, it was just openly racist. And there was even what we would call today, scientific racism.
Absolutely.
And what is today considered pseudoscience. But some of the great Egyptologists, even some of the founders of scientific approaches to archaeology,
like breasted in them.
Flinders Petrie, in terms of his approach to dating pottery, is still considered scientifically, basically, although it's been improved, scientifically sound. But his ideas about the racial components of Egyptian society and his theories about how Egyptians civilization rose because, basically, to put it crudely, smart white European people invaded and took over from the native dumb black population that hadn't made it out of the Stone Age, is like not only utterly racist and scientifically completely false, but I mean it's just stupid. But I mean, ever since at least the 1960s, new generations of archaeologists and anthropologists put these kind of old racist, but also scientifically, false ideas to bed, and nobody believes them anymore in the scientific or in the Egyptological community. To some extent, doesn't completely down, or at least the bad reputation that it's had hasn't always trickled down. And I think, in many ways, African American community Afrocentrist approach are still sort of holding white Egyptology to account for the sins of our ancestors from 100 years ago, thinking that we still buy into this crap. When we moved on, I mean, these theories, I'm 56 years old, but these theories were obsolete before I was born. And now, as I say, as social justice and social civil rights is moving, and even, and of course, as more and more progressive politics, etc., has even more and more taken over in academia. Somebody like Uros Matic has even become more, if you will, progressive, and even challenging things that were from my generation and my professor's generation, and is moving even beyond further into this. And when he writes his book, is trying to go even more cutting to new wave of challenging even ideas that were current in the 1980s about ethnicity and race, and all that, trying to weigh ideas that were still considered valid 30 years ago, and challenging ethnicity.
Your internet is going in and out.
Hey, Peter,
Oh,
Peter,
yeah,
hold on one second.
Like black, white. That's kind of, I'm trying to get them to stop using the racialized terms like black and white. Like indigenous Africans, or deal with the ethnicity and what they thought.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, it just circled in and out. Well, I can just try to go back, but I'm not sure why this keeps happening. Well, as I was saying, 100 years ago, you had essentially, white academia, like most white society, was essentially race, and there was even a form what we call scientific racism, where the scientific theories that are put forward were openly racist. And somebody like the great archaeologist William Flinders Petrie, and although his theories about dating pottery are still considered racist, of how we archaeologically based on pottery are still sound. Ideas, for instance, about the or ethnic identity of different peoples in Egypt and other foreign peoples. He had this idea that, if you put it simply, amounts to that Egypt's civilization arose from prehistory because of part white Europeans invaded Egypt and took over from the unintelligent black population, and were the ones who were responsible for creating Egyptian civilization. I mean, this is totally wrong. It was disproved, already in the 1950s or 1960s. Nobody believes it anymore, and they are not just scientifically false. Today, it just looks both racist and ridiculous. But again, even before I was born, there weren't Egyptians that accepted this. Today, as we move forward, even ideas that were current, like in the 1980s, are now being challenged. And so much more nuanced and better understanding of ethnicity, and new scholarship is being done to better understand how the Egyptians viewed themselves.
Okay. I hear you. So you're saying it's basically, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
So you're saying the scholarship is based in trying to understand how the indigenous populations represented themselves. So how would you categorize it? Would you say, like, would it be proper to say that to a certain extent they would be indigenous Africans, or just Egyptians with different groups coming in, mixing in with them? How would you do that?
Yeah, now Egyptians would have considered themselves first and foremost Egyptians. Okay. When we talk, that's another thing. I mean, it isn't just ideas about race, but whether people considered themselves black or white. Mm-hmm. It was more about who they saw themselves in terms of what we might call their ethnicity, which wasn't so much about race as it was about culture. To be Egyptian, it didn't matter what your skin color was. It was about, did you speak the Egyptian language? Did you follow Egyptian cultural ways? So they didn't look down on the Nubians or the Libyans or the Canaanites because of the color of their skin or their physical appearance. They looked down on them because they didn't speak Egyptian, because they didn't dress like Egyptian, because they didn't follow cultural norms. But if somebody from Syria or somebody from Nubia came to Egypt and they adopted Egyptian cultural norms, they spoke Egyptian and dressed like Egyptian, they were Egyptian, regardless of what their skin color was or even necessarily where they came from. And foreign peoples, unless they were brought by force, prisoners of war, somehow emigrated to Egypt, they would become, especially after a few generations, regardless of what their ultimate origins were and their appearance. But if they didn't essentially assimilate, then they would remain foreigners. And the Egyptians, there were always new peoples coming by choice or by force to Egypt, but they would assimilate, if not, in one generation, then after multiple generations, or even after the second generation. And so again, it wasn't about what we would call race or their physical appearance. It was more about culture. But the Egyptians were definitely cultural chauvinists. They looked down on people because they weren't Egyptian, but not because of what they looked like or what we would call race. Now, one of the other things that more recent research, there's a fellow, and maybe you know him sometime, his name is Stuart Tyson Smith, who has been looking at the concept of cultural and ethnic identity, looking at Egypt and its empire in Nubia during the New Kingdom, and Cushites and Egypt as they were in contact with one another. And he talks about, and I think this is interesting too, is how ethnic identity, and he doesn't really talk so much about race as ethnic identity,
correct,
as how that can be flexible and perspective. And he gives an example named Hecate. This man Hecanefer is sort of an official of the Egyptian Empire based in Nubia, and Hecanefer considers himself to be Egyptian. He's of Nubian birth, but in his tomb in Nubia, he depicts himself as a typical Egyptian. He shows himself with red skin. He has an Egyptian name. Hecanefer is an Egyptian name. And he depicts himself as an Egyptian, but he's an imperial official in Nubia, and his boss is the viceroy of Nubia, who's an Egyptian official, who has a tomb in Thebes from the time of King Tutankhamun. And in this tomb, he shows a scene where it's Nubian dignitaries coming to pay tribute to the Pharaoh Tutankhamun. And labeled among the officials that are coming, or the grandees who are coming to pay homage and pay their tribute of gold and other luxuries to the pharaoh, is a figure labeled as Hecanefer, is shown as a typical Nubian with black skin, in Nubian dress and with a Nubian hairstyle, and it's the same guy. So in Nubia, in his own tomb, Hecanefer depicts himself as a typical Egyptian with reddish skin and an Egyptian costume, claiming to be an Egyptian. But in his boss's tomb in Egypt, his boss, the viceroy of Kush, depicts him as a Nubian. So which is the real Hecanefer? It depends on your perspective.
That's interesting right there.
And the question is, which one is right? Who knows?
So don't jump out the window.
I don't know which one is right. But the thing is, it's all a matter of perspective. They're both a little bit right. But in this case, it depends on the perspective of who will. To think he's an Egyptian, and his boss wants to suspect that they each have their own agenda, and we can see this in the with immigrants, that somebody who is them from the outside, that's not from their ethnic group, emphasize the fact that they're foreign. And they want to say, no, I'm not American. I'm just like you. So it becomes a matter of perspective, or what kind of emphasis you place on or sometimes it's situational. you want to, depending on your audience, you want to emphasize, emphasize your ethnicity on what situation you're in.
Okay. It's a great point. I think you did a great job in that section right there. I really appreciate that. So I want to kind of move forward into some of your work that you just came back from dealing with the hyper style. Let me get that straight. That was the
Hall, yes.
The hyper style hall. Now let me ask you this. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the work of Dr. Timothy Kendall.
Yes.
He did some work at Jebel Bakr.
Jebel
Bakr.
Yes.
Okay. So how related is Karnak to that? Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, they're both temples to the god Amun. Jebel Barkal, actually, it's interesting because in Arabic it roughly translates to something like the pure or the blessed mountain. Jebel is the word for mountain in Arabic, and of course it's this big. It almost looks like one of those mesas in the desert of America. It's this big, giant platform of rock that's out, and on the edge of it, it has this hill of rock that sticks out from the main part of the mesa. And in ancient times, it was sacred to the god Amun. It's deep in fact, it's deep within the area. It was known as and during the New Kingdom, when Egypt had an empire in this part of the world, it was one of the major centers of the Egyptian empire. And then later, when Kush gained its independence from Egypt after the end of the New Kingdom, it continued to be a major holy site and a center for the Kushite kingdom, and later these other civilizations that are essentially a continuation of the kingdom of Kush, the Hotten and Meroitic civilizations that even continued after the end of Pharaonic times, even down into almost into the Middle Ages, in the time of the Romans and beyond. But it was sacred to the god Amun. And in fact, the pinnacle of rock was believed to be a giant cobra who was an embodiment of the god Amun. But it was believed that the mountain itself, inside the mountain, the god Amun himself lived in the mountain. And the ancient Egyptian name for this mountain was actually the Pure Mountain. And so it was the most important and holy place for the god Amun in all of Nubia. And to some extent, its importance as a major site for Amun even extended as far north as Thebes, because Thebes, of course, and especially the Temple of Karnak, was the major, the cult center, the holy place in Egypt, and to some extent, if you will, all the world, for the god Amun. It was like his major cult center in all of Egypt and the world. But there's even images of Amun of Jebel Barkal in the temple of Karnak, that actually shows him as a snake. And there's also an image in the Ramses II's temple in Abu Simbel in Nubia that shows him worshiping a figure of Amun that's inside the mountain, and also the giant cobra that's sticking outside the mountain. So there's a connection between Amun of Karnak and Amun of Jebel Barkal. And it's the Amun of Jebel Barkal and the cult of Amun that Dr. Kendall has been working on. And as I say, there was, and it's also interesting that after the end of the New Kingdom, when you had this line of Kushite kings, who originally, of course, just ruled Nubia, but during what's known as the 25th dynasty, where you had, well, his name is either Yankee or sometimes Pie or Pi, in Egypt, and then other kings like Taharka, his successor, and some of the other Batarkas, the most famous one. They also then ruled over Egypt for a time and built monuments at Karnak, and were very interested in promoting the cult of Amun, but especially in addition to Nubia itself or Kush, but they also were very interested in worshiping Amun by building monuments in Thebes, especially at Karnak as well. So there was this real intimate connection between Amun of Karnak and Amun of Kush, especially at Jebel Barkal.
So, okay, with that idea had originated in Jebel Barkal, I think that's what Timothy was kind of talking about. I think he might have said that. I'm not sure. Would you think that idea?
Well, yes. I mean, there were other temples to Amun that were built at other places in Nubia. So, for instance, at Abu Simbel, or other temples of Ramses II in different parts of Nubia that were dedicated to the cult of Amun. But the thing is, there was the very special form, if you will, the indigenous form of Amun that was unique to Nubia was really Amun of Jebel Barkal. In addition to his form as this, this giant snake that lived in the mountain, the other unique form of Amun that existed, that was Amun of Jebel Barkal, was the form of Amun that was a man with the ram's head. Now, of course, the sacred animal of Amun was a ram, but actually, otherwise, although the sacred animal of Amun was a ram and could appear as just as a ram-headed human figures of Amun were relatively rare. But this ram-headed Amun of Jebel Barkal was rather unique and was the very specific form, and he otherwise was a bit different than the normal aspects of Amun that you see otherwise. And he was very specifically associated with Jebel Barkal in particular. So, and he was always called Amun of Jebel Barkal. So even when you see images of this ram-headed Amun elsewhere, even at Karnak, he is always called Amun of Jebel Barkal, because Egyptian gods, although they could appear in different places, many of these, there were many special forms of gods, of the same god, that were associated with specific places. So you could have, for instance, a goddess Hathor that is Hathor of the city of Dendara, or I'm trying to think off the top of my head, Horus of the city of Edfu, and lots of other ones. And there were other forms of Horus, there were other forms of Amun, there were other forms of any number of gods, but there were certain forms of these gods that were specifically tied to a specific place or even to a specific temple. There was a specific form of the goddess Mut, who was the wife of the god Amun, who was associated with her temple at Karnak. And so this was a specific form of Amun that wasn't just located in Nubia, but was specifically located in the temple of Jebel Barkal. That was his home. And even if he could be worshipped and appear in temples, even in Egypt or all across Nubia, his home base was in Jebel Barkal.
Okay, so that's all right. I don't want to get too far past, because I want you to actually talk about the archaeological dig you just came off of and what you was actually doing and how you kind of explained what Karnak was. But I want to make actually this last thing. Okay, so based off you studying the divine kingship in Egypt,
yeah,
I've heard individuals make the point that, I make the point, and it's just me as a novice, that when I'm reading certain works, that maybe the divine kingship itself may have come from Nubia. How close to factual am I, or how far away from I, or I'm just spreading the evidence too thin? What say you on that?
Well, I think that that both Egypt and Nubia and even some other African civilizations had ideas about divine kingship.
Okay.
There was also a debate, I guess about 30 years ago, based on some archaeological objects were found, debating whether or not some of the earliest aspects of Egyptian civilizations may have originated in Nubia.
Okay.
I think that the Egyptian aspect of divine kingship and other unique aspects of Egyptian culture, by and large, originated in Egypt.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean because there was cultural contact between Egypt and Nubia in the very earliest phases of Egyptian civilization,
Mm-hmm.
that there couldn't be parallel developments.
Okay.
But one of the things, archaeologists and anthropologists debate is just when you have these, whenever, you could say this anything from the invention of fire to other kinds of inventions or other kinds of cultural and historical patterns. It used to be thought, again, 100 years or more, that the wheel or writing or the invention of fire or certain kinds of architecture, it was invented one place in the world and then it spread out to every other place. But in fact, you find that certain kinds or many different kinds of technologies and cultural patterns, ideas could be invented at multiple places across the world independently at different times. So the idea that the king might be a god could be invented at different places at different times, whether in nearby civilizations like Egypt and Nubia, or whether halfway across the world like Egypt and China, or Egypt and South or Central America. So I don't think it necessarily has to be the case that one got the idea from the other.
Okay.
And there are examples of sacred kingship, if you want to call it that occur in other African civilizations, including West Africa, that there doesn't necessarily have to be a connection. I know, for instance, there was and this is also true in some aspects of Afrocentric, theory. And I know the Senegalese
Diops.
Diops, yes. He had this idea of essentially unity, is that aspects of, or if not all of African civilization arose in one place and in Egypt. And again, bold idea, and he was ranked against European ideas that discount the importance and the sophistication of African culture, and the notion that that civilization could have even arose in Egypt. Of course, this was at the tail end also of that even Egypt was truly an African civilization. It was born of European invaders, when this old racist theory was talking about we're still on its legs and hadn't been rejected European as scholars, and arguing against this before the Europeans were up again. But I think he went too far the other way, because Africa is an extremely diverse place.
Absolutely.
You look at one of my colleagues who's an African historian. He has this map in his office that shows how many dozens and dozens of languages there are, even today. And when you look at the patterns of languages, if anything, it's become more simplified. When you have that many different languages, think about how many cultures and subcultures there are. So the idea that there's one African civilization, or the idea that one particular civilization gave rise to every different culture and civilization in Africa, is, I think, doing a disservice to all those others. And again, what we know anthropologically elsewhere in the world is that all kinds of different cultures and civilizations arose independently, invented all kinds of as it turns out, very similar ideas and patterns of culture and civilization and technology quite independently from each other. And that could have happened, and I'm sure it did. In fact, I'm certain it did in Africa, without Egypt being essentially the godfather or the midwife for every other civilization or culture that ever existed in Africa.
All right, let's pause for 1 second. Let's pause for one. Hey, ladies and gentlemen, a beautiful afternoon today. We have in the building today my special guest, Dr. Peter Brand. And we also have Brother Ankh, who calls himself the God Killer, and he's part of the whole Pseudo Killers movement. Let me bring my co-sparring partner for the day, Brother Ankh. Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce Peter Brand. He's basically an instructor or a teacher at the University of Michigan. His main areas of focus in Egyptology are the history and culture of the New Kingdom, particularly in the late 18th dynasty and the Ramesside periods. He uses a multidisciplinary approach in his research and teaching that integrates history, art history, language, and epigraphy. Subjects that interest him are the part of ongoing research, including Egyptian foreign relations and diplomacy. All right, he teaches a lot of different courses about Egypt, of the Pharaohs, Imperial Egypt, Egyptian epigraphy, Ramesside, military and diplomatic texts. As far as books, he does have a couple books out. I do want to point out, if you go on Amazon, you could probably purchase a few of his books. He does have a particular book that I'm interested in, is Ramesses II, Egypt's Ultimate Pharaoh. He has other writings and articles also. All right, in the introduction, in the video, you're going to see all his qualifications and all the articles he has written before. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce you to the one and only Dr. Peter Brand. How are you doing today, sir?
Doing well, and here I'm just saying hello from my very messy home office here in Memphis. So I am very happy to be on your podcast and look forward to this discussion.
All right, so let's get to this whole thing about you. How did you get into? I don't want to tell you anybody's age or anything, but as a youth growing up, you were born in Canada. Am I correct?
Yes. And then I moved to Texas.
Canada, right? Did you grow? Did you have high school here, or did you have high school in Canada?
No, I moved to Texas when I was about 12, so that's where I went to high school.
So how you got into Egypt? Was it a movie? Was it the Moses movie? I mean, how did you get into Egypt and the studies?
I think it was a couple of things. Like when I was still in Canada, it was during the 1970s, and the Tutankhamun exhibit was coming, and so there was Tut mania back then, and so there was all kinds of stuff about King Tut. But I also remember looking, in the library, checking out books about Egypt, but I also was interested in dinosaurs. And I don't know, I think Egypt stuck more than the dinosaurs did. Otherwise, I'd probably become a paleontologist. But I think King Tut was one of the things. And then this National Geographic TV special and all these old National Geographic magazines that my dad had collected. And a lot of them were about moving those big temples at Abu Simbel of Ramses II. And I think that's what got me into the particular work that I do on Ramses and his time.
Okay. When I contacted you originally, you were in Egypt working on a project with the Karnak temple. Am I correct?
Yes, I work there, and I'm not actually an archaeologist. I don't dig holes in the ground. I record inscriptions on the walls of the monuments. I was always fascinated as well by King Tut, but my idea of what archaeology was essentially removing gold treasures from tombs and cataloging them. And then when I found out that it really was just, digging up bits of broken pottery and mud bricks, it sort of lost its allure. But I saw a documentary about how they drew pictures of these beautiful inscriptions on the walls of temples and tombs with these beautiful colors and paintings. And I like drawing pictures. I was sort of an artist when I was a kid. And so I said, that sounds much more interesting than digging up bits of broken pottery. So that's how I got interested in this kind of work.
That's beautiful. So what do you enjoy most about teaching at the University of Memphis?
I love just, I guess I was a born teacher. It's sort of like I hated when I got to the point in school then there was no more show and tell. And so I guess I just have the teaching bug. And I especially love, the undergraduate courses, just sharing knowledge with students. And the graduate courses where I do the advanced study for students that are doing their master's degree and their PhD degree in Egyptology, and going really in deep on the subject.
Mhm.
And the trip to Egypt that we just did to work at Karnak, one of the wonderful parts of that was that I had 3 students, and it was their first trip to Egypt. And I mean, I've been to Egypt many times over the past 30 years, but every time I go with students that have never been before, it feels partly like it's my first time, and partly like I get to be the tour guide that takes them to introduce it to them for the first time, and that's always just a magical experience because it's like teaching them, but showing them the wonderful world of ancient Egypt. It's just magical.
That's beautiful, man. I'm good to hear that. Let me ask you this. Are you currently working on, I know you go to Karnak and you go into the temples, you look at scripts and so forth. Are you working on a new book, or what's going on as far as writing is concerned?
Well, I sort of took a break for the past year when I finished the Ramses book, but my next project is actually going to look at how the pharaohs use gold. And I mean, again, I think this goes back to my interest in King Tut when I was a kid. And there's a lot of books on gold that look at, the history of all the different gold objects, or like catalogs of all the golden treasures. But what I'm interested in is how the pharaohs used gold. And it wasn't so much as a financial instrument. They didn't buy things with gold. They didn't make money, but it's how they, if you will, bought people with gold, how they used it as what I like to call a power tool. They monopolized the acquisition of gold, like mining the gold. It was a royal monopoly, but they also took the gold and they took them into royal workshops and manufactured all kinds of luxury objects, all the beautiful jewelry, but all kinds of fancy furniture and gilded statues and all this kind of stuff. And then they gave it to certain groups of people, and even to the gods. They gave the gold to the high officials of the court. They gave gold to brave soldiers and generals. They gave all kinds of rich golden gifts to the gods in the temples, and they used golden gifts to other kings in diplomacy as a way of enhancing the king's power and authority and his prestige. And of course, they decorated themselves, as you can see from King Tut's golden tomb, to enhance their own prestige. So it's sort of the story of the way the pharaohs used gold, not to buy things, but if you will, to buy people, and even to buy the gold, the gods themselves. So it's really looking at that story about what gold was for, and how the pharaohs used it to sort of enhance their status and their power.
All right, Peter, I'm going to show on the screen while you're talking, not to cover your face while you're talking, but this is one of the right the monuments. As a matter of fact, let me make Peter big. It's going to still cover him. But the monuments of Seti I, epigraphic, historical, and art historical analysis. Can you tell us what this is about?
Yeah, so this was based on my dissertation. The book is very expensive, but you can get a free PDF of it on my academia.edu page. I think it's out of print anyways. But it's based on my dissertation, so it's not I'm the first to admit it's not basically a rip-roaring good read. It's a very scientific book. But Ramses' father was this King Seti I. You can see the cover image. I was interested in him because he built this one temple that was just really beautiful painted carvings on the walls. And he also was the one that built this giant building, the Hypostyle Hall, where I'm working, recording the inscriptions. It's this giant forest of huge columns that the size, it covers an acre of land. You could fit a medieval cathedral inside of it. And it's this forest of 134 gigantic columns, and every part of it is covered with inscriptions, even the roof. And it's like the eighth wonder of the ancient world. And so I'm fascinated by these giant buildings, how they built them and how they decorated them. And Seti is one of these kings that was overshadowed by his own successor. And so, he was a hard act. His son Ramses II was in this case not a hard act to follow, but a hard act to proceed. He's overshadowed by his own son Ramses the Great. And this is another book about the Hypostyle Hall that I recently published with one of my former grad students and my predecessor, who had died in 2000. And it's translations and analysis of all the wall scenes in the Hypostyle Hall. And this is again available in a hard copy, but you can also download a PDF from the University of Chicago website. Has beautiful photographs of all of the inscriptions on the walls and the beautiful carvings. It's a scientific book. It's more of a reference. It's not the kind of thing you would actually read as consult, but it's more of a scientific book. But beautiful pictures of all these wonderful carvings of Seti and of King Ramses as well.
And then the first book we spoke about was hold on, let me get it here on the screen. This one here. Right here. So this is the one I spoke about first.
This is my newest book, and this is the first book that actually I wrote for a broader audience. I like to say, and hopefully people will agree, that it's a good read. It's everything anybody would ever want to know about Ramses, but I tried to make it, as accessible as possible. It's very well illustrated. It's also cheaper than every other book I've ever written. It's only about, a soft cover is only about $40, and I think you can get and it's 600 pages long with over 200 illustrations. So it's a good read, and as I tried to make it interesting. So it was actually a fun book to write, but it was also the hardest book to write, because it's actually easier to write a scientific book when you could just go blah, 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 because only 10 people on earth are probably ever going to read it. But when you're trying to make a book that you want people to read, then it actually is a lot of hard work. So I'm very proud of it, and I hope people will enjoy it. And actually, it's probably the only book I've written that people could afford. That first book, Seti, it actually cost like $280.
You know what, Peter? We enjoy good books like this book right here. We was talking a little bit earlier. Barkal's the survey, right? Bruce Williams, Oriental Institute, Nubian Expedition, Volume 3. I got 5 volumes of it, and it's talking about that Costul incense burner.
That's the one.
It agrees with what you was talking about earlier. But go ahead, Garfield. I'm enjoying this part of it.
I'm
pretty
enjoy
your books, though. I just want to say that. Like, I'm gonna buy the good ones, the ones that cost. You get that.
All right. So we've gone over your students, your teaching, and everything. So Ankh, you back up, man. Your turn, man.
No, go ahead. Yeah, I'm enjoying that. I got all mines out. I swear.
All right.
Almost.
Let me ask you this: as far as Egyptians, in all your research, as far as Egypt is concerned, what is one thing in the world today that says, you know what, you would say, thanks for the Egyptians, we have this today? Is there something that you say that reminds you of the culture when you study it and you live your everyday life?
Well, I mean, I think that a lot of what came down through later cultures was influenced by Egypt. It's hard to point to one sort of standout thing, but one of the ways that I think Egypt is relevant is that the more you look at ancient Egypt and the way the ancient Egyptian people were, is the more you realize that they really were human. They were just like us. They had the same sort of hopes, fears, and dreams. The more you realize that there's really nothing new under the sun. You can read love poetry from ancient Egypt. You can read literature of the stories of people from ancient Egypt. You can see the way they did things. And even though like they didn't have the modern technology, even though their religious beliefs were very different, and there were certainly all kinds of ways that they approached daily life, etc., that were very different from us. There were so many things that were just like us in terms of their humanity, that I think that study of ancient Egypt, or really any of these other ancient cultures, are not, if you will, just something that doesn't matter, or that's a waste of time, or is just some kind of frou-frou things that is kind of fun and interesting, but really is irrelevant to our lives today. I really try to do this with all ancient cultures and civilization. Maybe I'm just trying to justify my job as an ancient historian. But when I teach a general class, World History 1. And it's a class on the origins of human civilization, and trying to talk about why do we study prehistory? Why do we study the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans and ancient Egypt and ancient Mesopotamia and the origins of civilization? And asking these questions, well, why does it all matter? And one of my favorite, comebacks that might seem kind of strange is, well, when's the last time you ate a hamburger? And people, what? What does that have to do with ancient history? Well, my answer is this: why are you eating a hamburger? That is made from beef on a wheat bun that's sitting on a ceramic plate. Well, why isn't it made from a wildebeest or a rhinoceros meat sitting on a bun from some obscure African root vegetable that nobody would eat today, or maybe on made from some kind of ground up flour made from some other kind of plant that we don't eat today, made on some kind of woven matting, some other kind of plant that we don't eat today? Well, it's because 10 or 15,000 years ago, people domesticated cattle, and because they had picked wild grasses, taken the seed from these wild grasses, and had domesticated them, and they had become meat. And then they had come up into flour and learned to make dough out of them, bake them in ovens, and they had invented bread. Then they had also taken clay, river, and they had put it in fire and invented ceramics.
Okay.
So basically, the thing we eat and technology or household utensils that we use in our house that we are exposed to every day are based on technologies and ways of doing things and patterns of life that were invented tens of thousands of years ago, that are still intimately parts of our life today. And writing is another thing. Now, we don't write, obviously we don't use Egyptian hieroglyphs.
Correct.
But the invention of writing is another aspect. And there are still a few little traces of the story of how writing evolved that actually do involve ancient Egyptian, even though writing has evolved radically. But some of the earliest steps towards the alphabet, which the earliest alphabet was from Phoenicia, in what's today Lebanon. the Phoenician alphabet was partly inspired by Egyptian hieroglyphs, and it later inspired the Greek alphabet, which inspired the Latin alphabet, which is basically the alphabet we use today. Well, the letter A, the capital A, came from the Phoenician alphabet, and the letter A was actually originally represented a pictograph of the head of a bull with its horns. If you turn it on its side or turn it upside down, the bottom part of the letter A is the horns, and the little triangular part is the head of the bull.
So, okay.
Before you get into that,
I was going to ask about that though.
You work on the new kingdom time period. You have different deities from the Canaan region being adopted by Egyptian pharaohs and so forth.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little bit, as far as why did they feel the need to adopt deities when they had enough? They had thousands of deities already in Egypt. Why did they feel the need to adapt? Or is it that they just like those deities and said, hey, you know what, let me bring them into our culture and our stories?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. On the one hand, when you're talking about polytheistic religions, religions where you believe in multiple gods, once you believe in more than one deity, it doesn't really matter whether it's 2 or 2,000 or 2 million. If you will, the more gods, the merrier. And on the second hand, as Egypt expanded its empire into these foreign lands, and especially during the New Kingdom, as it became very heavily involved in this area of Canaan and Lebanon and Syria, where there were all these existing deities that were worshipped. There were gods like Reshep and the goddess Astarte, among others. There was also a god Baal, who in the Bible is a bad guy, but otherwise not necessarily an evil god by any means among Canaanite and Syrian religion. In fact, his name in the Semitic languages like Canaanite simply means the Lord, like a master. As Egypt became more and more involved over the course of the New Kingdom, but already in the middle 18th dynasty, worship of these gods or interest in these gods became more intense, because as the pharaohs had conquered these regions, the worship of these gods, or the fact that these gods had acquiesced to the pharaoh conquering these lands, it was considered that the gods of these lands favored the pharaoh. And so kings, it was actually the kings of this time period, the pharaohs of this time period, that took on worship of these gods, as seeing them as foreign deities who favored the pharaohs as ruling over these lands, and that they began to import worship of these gods back into Egypt. And also there were increasingly, as various prisoners of war and immigrants into Egypt from these foreign lands who were brought back to Egypt, and also brought the worship of these gods back into Egypt as well. And so for these reasons, as Egypt became more and more cosmopolitan, and at the same time, you also had all kinds of other foreign cultural influences from Egypt's empire, new words, from foreign languages and other kinds of technologies and other kinds of cultural practices. They're coming into Egypt, into Syrian and Canaanite words that were making their way into the Egyptian language. Foreign technologies, including including things like the introduction of the horse and chariot and the composite bow, but also other kinds of technologies. And of course, many foreign peoples that were making their way into Egypt, who also brought their languages and their cultures and their deities with them into Egypt. Egypt was becoming much more cosmopolitan, and so they were also bringing their religion, and this was becoming more and more accepted by the Egyptian populace. and also patronized by the kings who patronized these gods, who they saw as also approving of and supporting Egypt's domination of these foreign lands. And there was also at least one Nubian deity, a god named Dedwen, who was also seen as showing favor of Egypt's rule over Nubia, who then also made his way into the pantheon of Egyptian deities, and he was known as Dedwen, Lord of Nubia, and who is also shown as one of the gods that shows favor to the pharaoh, and who is also worshipped in Egypt as well. So I think there's a combination of reasons why these foreign deities then become increasingly common, and this only ramps up over the course of the New Kingdom. It starts appearing in the middle of the 18th dynasty and reaches a climax during the Ramesside period, when we see more and more commonly the cult of these various, especially the Canaanite and Syrian deities, being worshipped by all levels of Egyptian society, but also becoming patrons of the pharaohs.
Oh, okay.
Mm.
That's beautiful, beautiful. Go ahead, Ankh. The floor is yours, brother.
Okay, so all right, let's go back a little bit to the Phoenician script. You talked about the alphabet. So for me, I was familiar with a temple at the Sinai Peninsula.
Yes.
I think is Sobek El Kadam.
Sarabat al-Qadim, yes.
Yes, and there's some inscriptions, the Proto-Sinaitic. And so did the Phoenician script come out of that? Because you said the Phoenician script was kind of the oldest. I know they're very similar. What say you?
It's possible. The thing is, I knew this guy. He was a brilliant fellow who did his dissertation. His name, James Hoke.
Okay.
And he did his dissertation in his first book on these foreign Semitic loanwords. By Semitic, we mean these words that are from Canaanite and Syrian languages that were very similar to like ancient Babylonian and are related to modern Semitic languages like Hebrew and Arabic.
Okay.
And Ethiopic. But I mean, it's a family of languages that include these ancient languages like Canaanite. But he was studying all these Canaanite and Syrian loanwords that made their way into the Egyptian language during the New Kingdom. And after he finished, he was trying to study these Proto-Sinaitic language. The problem was there were only a few of them from that site that you talk about.
Okay.
And the thing is, nobody really had been able to decipher them, and I don't think he really was able to make much progress because, again, it was a case of too little data. And although they showed some similarities with early Phoenician texts, and there was obviously they were influenced by Egyptian hieroglyphs, and you might call them a missing link, if you will.
Mm.
They were not similar enough to either hieroglyphs or Phoenician, or there wasn't enough information there to be able to really know exactly what's going on. And we really couldn't, as far from what I understand, and I'm not really an expert on it, from what I understand, there wasn't enough there to be able to figure out exactly what's going on there. So the best guess is that they were an early attempt to write some kind of non-Egyptian language, presumably some kind of early Canaanite or Semitic language using a script that was adapted from the Egyptian hieroglyphic system that was maybe some kind of proto or early attempt at something that was similar to what became Phoenician, whether it was supposed to be some kind of alphabetic or partly alphabetic script, or at least some kind of more simplified system. But other than that, nobody really knows exactly what was going on there.
I think Alan Gardner kind of thought it might have represented the sounds, like in the
Yeah.
alphabet kind of sort. I think he looked at that. But that's interesting, and I like the way you put that, because that leap. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, at the very least, you would expect it was some kind of attempt to write, a sound like phonetic.
Yes.
I mean, because ultimately the Phoenician and other later alphabetic systems are attempts to strip away all these extra signs. And in Egyptian, people always wonder, like, what are all these hieroglyphs? Well, people often think, well, they're pictures. That every picture represents a word. In Chinese, every character represents a word.
Okay.
Well, there are some pictures in glyphs where the glyph represents a word, what we call a logogram, which literally means an idea picture. And there are glyphs that represent purely a sound, either a single, like what we would call a letter, like the sound for M or the sound for N or P or I. And there are also glyphs that represent two sounds or three sounds, like MR or PN, or three sounds like K, I'm trying to, why can't I think of one, like Kepper? But there are many, many sounds, perhaps the majority of signs that actually represent, that are purely pictorial, that help you understand the meaning of a word, but actually have no sound value whatsoever. We call them determinatives. They tell you an idea about what the word is, meaning is about. So verbs of motion have a little picture of walking legs that walk by themselves, or words that have to do with emotion or speaking have a picture of a man that's touching his mouth with his hand, or words that have to do with violent action or vigorous action show a man holding a stick as if he's about to hit something or somebody. Or even words for abstract ideas, like the word to think, actually have a picture of a papyrus roll to convey the idea of an abstract idea that you can only conceive of in writing. So that's how you conceive of the idea of an abstract idea. But most hieroglyphic signs are these pictorial signs that have no actual sound value. Well, if you can strip away all those other kinds of signs and just get down to an alphabetic system, it makes the writing system extremely simple. And of course, even getting rid of all these signs that have 2 letters or 3 letters, well, then you can get down to an alphabet that only has, the Hebrew alphabet, what does it have, like 13 signs, or our alphabet has 26 signs. Even the largest alphabet, might have, at most 30 or 35 letters in it. That's much better than having, hundreds or thousands of signs, because then theoretically anybody can memorize, 26 or 13, or even if it was 50. That's much more doable than having to know hundreds or thousands of signs. So that was sort of the whole point of developing alphabetic signs, because then it's a much more simple system.
Easier for the record keeping. So yeah, for the very reasons you spoke of, on how just because it was a picture of something didn't mean that. That's how that is exactly why they actually struggled in trying to decipher the ancient language. Am I correct in that?
I think so, yes. And in fact, when we think of the earliest writing systems, they were all very, very complex. But that was actually a feature. It wasn't a bug, because I think they deliberately made them complex. In part because being a scribe was an elite profession,
Okay.
And they deliberately didn't want everybody to be able to read. The idea, I think, in ancient societies that were also very, hierarchical. The idea that reading would be universal, the idea of universal literacy would have horrified the pharaohs or the elites. The idea that any peasant could read would have just been like the world turned upside down. It would have been the most radical idea. And of course, it is interesting is even when you do get alphabetic systems, it really isn't until modern times that the idea of universal literacy. I mean, they had alphabetic signs, since ancient Greece and ancient Rome. But in the Middle Ages, even the lords and the kings couldn't read. They had to have like priests. That's why the idea of like clerical work, because it was the clergy who could actually read. It wasn't until the invention of universal education in early republics and democracies, like when you actually had universal education, beginning in the 19th century in this country, that you began to have most of the population who could read. But even if you go back to the Renaissance or even the 1700s, most people couldn't read. And
okay, go ahead.
yeah, so again, even with the invention of alphabets, that didn't mean that suddenly most people were able to read, but it at least made it easier for people who were learning to read to be able to learn to read. But I mean, learning to read in ancient Egypt or ancient China or ancient, Mesopotamia, they wanted it to be difficult. And learning how to be a scribe in Egypt, it was a bit like getting your PhD today. It was advanced training, to be able to be literate.
That's interesting. You made that connection between clerical and the clergy. I just wanted to emphasize that. That was I didn't know that. That was interesting. And so yeah, we have this idea that it was widespread literacy, but I'm glad I appreciate the way you frame that. It gives us a better idea of the thought process with the ancient people. I appreciate that. Definitely do. And it's amazing how the internet is working perfectly. When we talked about the other ideas of ethnicity in the land of the Pharaohs, the things seemed to kept breaking up. I don't know, was that you, Garfield, messing it up like that? That was a deep conversation.
I took everything on my computer. But let me ask you this.
Thank you.
You said early in the conversation that you see when you walk around today, you look at say, hey, that guy reminds me of King Tut. This guy reminds me of Ramesses and so forth. What percentage, in your opinion, do you think the modern Egyptian? Because the modern Egyptians we see, we normally see the Arabs. They normally on TV, we normally see a lot of Arabic people, and then they show a little bit of the Egyptians there, what they're doing. But what percentage would you put on the current population of in your professional opinion of what the people who descend from the ancient culture? Because they're not the same people, but people who would be the closest to the ancient Egyptians.
Well, the thing is, to be honest with you, I couldn't possibly say, because I think the way you would have to, and I know there's been some recent work basically on genetic testing, but again, when you talk about Arabs, being Arab isn't like being, a racial idea. It's basically an ethnic identity. So, for instance, being Arab means you speak Arabic, and you adhere to Arab culture. Because again, if you look at the Arab world, it stretches across North Africa and across the Middle East. But for instance, in terms of people that are living in Iraq, as opposed to people that are living in Morocco, they're all Arab. But or people that are living in Sudan, as opposed to people that are living in Syria, they're Arab. But if you were classifying them by, and again, this is why terms like calling Arab somebody is Arab is based on quote unquote race, or even to the extent that race is really a truly meaningful category anymore. Would you say that somebody from Sudan is quote unquote the same as somebody from Syria, but they're Arab, because Sudanese are Arab.
I get your point. I definitely stand corrected. Definitely.
And the other thing too is, again, Egypt has always been a melting pot. I mean, it stands at the crossroads of Egypt and the Middle East as a gateway between Egypt and a gateway between North Africa down into Central Africa, into Middle East, which is part of Asia. It's also connected into the Mediterranean, which means it's bringing by sea people that could have come in from Southern Europe and all across the Mediterranean. And it wasn't just in historic times. This would have been happening in prehistoric times. So, and it wasn't just like this happened after the end of Pharaonic times, or that it only happened, beginning in the times when the Greeks were coming into Egypt, like, Alexander the Great, and afterwards, and then the Romans. There would have been huge intermixing of populations going out even into prehistory, to say nothing of what was happening, in Pharaonic times and Greco-Roman times, all throughout the post-antique period. Even when we talk about something like the Arab conquest, again, people that came in, like with the Mamluks and, the Abyssinians, all these other various people who came in during the Islamic period as foreign rulers, the Ottomans, etc. These were the elites that came in, but it wasn't necessarily massive invasions. And so the core of the Egyptian population was still there, although, again, there were all kinds of people that came in at various points. So trying to, balance out or measure percentages, I think, is very difficult, if not impossible. So again, I know I would find it very hard to even take a guess, but I'm not sure even a genetic specialist could give you figures.
Yeah.
But I do think it is a mix. But I also think that a substantial proportion of the Egyptian population, and again, I don't think you can say, oh, this person, is pure blood ancient Egyptian, but this person, is, they're fully descended from the ancient Greeks, or this person is, oh, they're obviously from the the Mamluks, or, they are solidly Ottoman Turks, and these people over here, they're obviously purely, Syrian immigrants. You see what I mean? Or that these people are, they're descended from, the Libyans that were brought to Egypt in the reign of Ramses III, and these people over here are like Cushites that, came to Egypt during the 25th dynasty. They're all blended together. Just to give you another example, I had a colleague here who studies like Native Americans, and also like the intermixing of Native Americans with both white and also African Americans. Mm-hmm. And, they talk about how the Native American populations just somehow vanished, at the end of the 19th century. Well, it didn't vanish. It just blended in. Not just with, not just with, with white Americans, but also with African Americans. And this guy, he was African American. He's now moved to another university. But, he went and you look at him and say, oh, he's African American. But he does have some Native American ancestry. Well, he went to visit this somewhere up in Michigan, I think. I don't know if they were Iroquois, but one of the northern U.S. Native American tribes, and they accepted him as a full-blood Native American, like member of the tribe, because he had this heritage. So again, and it also gets back to the discussion where we were talking about ethnicity, and ethnicity being a sort of a relative, ethnic identity as being a relative term depending on one's perspective.
And
before you go, I think you basically told us that race is a social construct. And
Yeah,
of theory in biology. That's
and they're two different things. Because again, if you look at DNA, we're all the same.
Absolutely.
9.9%. There you go.
99%.
Well, we're 99% similar to chimpanzees.
Absolutely.
But in terms of, I mean, in terms of humans, we're all 100% the same. And the only genetic differences is that, again, the difference between me and you guys, the genetic variation is really no difference than the genetic variation between me and my siblings or my cousins, really. I mean, because again, I always like to give the example between dog breeds. The genetic difference between a miniature Schnauzer, a Dachshund, and a Great Dane and a German Shepherd is almost non-existent, even though they look totally different.
Man,
it's all the outward physical appearance.
Right. I was going to say that it's just a visual. It's the
but the tiny variation in genetic differences is practically insignificant. They're so minor. It's like, would you say somebody's a different race because they have green eyes versus blue eyes, or blonde hair versus red hair?
0.01% causing problems.
Less than 1%, though. It's really like a fraction of a thousand.
99.1%. That's less than. So yeah, I can actually support you in that, and the statements that you were making about the population, because we read this work right here. The genetics of African population, health and disease, and it's from the Cambridge Studies in Biology and Evolutionary Anthropology and Samatakiyata. He talks about the very thing that you framed up, and so I actually support you with that. I can actually put documentation behind what you said, so populations aren't actually frozen in time. Like, you freeze a population, bring it forward. And so that leads me to my next question. So then it would kind of go along with what you're talking about. So as far as state formation, how much validity do you put into Egypt's existence having a lot to do with, at least from population, probably before Egypt, before it was even a state, before it was even called that, or people even knew where they was at, the Green Sahara, the areas in the southernmost portions of the Nile Valley, and areas in the Levant coming together? How close am I to seeing this picture looking that way?
Okay. Can I just add one more thing about what we were just discussing, though?
Yes, you can. Absolutely.
In terms of the human population, is also that as far as human origins as we understand them, we're all Africans.
Absolutely.
Yeah. But now it's in terms of the origins of the Egyptian state. I mean, just to clarify, are you asking how that relates to the formations of the state in other areas, like in, say, Mesopotamia and that thing?
No. All right. Let me rephrase. Let me make it a little bit better. So I've studied material on aspects of the drying up of the Sahara, and populations move towards the Nile Valley, not just the southern part, the central portions and northern portions. And I also understand that ancient migrations, 15,000, 20,000 BCE, moving towards the valley from the Levant area, and populations also migrating just back and forth. So as far as state formation, how much do you include that type of material in your mindset?
Well, I mean, the thing is, it set the necessary preconditions that eventually did allow for state formations. It doesn't necessarily mean that state formation necessarily had to have happened. But presumably it couldn't have happened without those changes, because again, if the what they call the wet phase, where it had remained a wet grassy dry land, that people could have remained hunter-gatherers and saw no reason to migrate into the Nile River, and basically the Neolithic Revolution, in other words, the invention of agriculture, where people took up farming, never had to make that change, then they never would have had a reason to form, cities and towns that eventually led to the formation of the state. So it was part of the necessary preconditions. Now, is it possible that they could have, after the, drying up of the Sahara and people moving into the Nile Valley and setting up, these towns and villages around agricultural communities, was it a foregone conclusion that eventually they would have coalesced into early state formation? Was that inevitable? Possibly. I mean, certainly you have other parts around the world where this does happen. I'm not well versed enough in comparative archaeology to know if it always seems to have happened elsewhere. But I mean, there are places certainly where it did. There's a scholar named Bruce Trigger who studied this phenomenon of state formation in other areas. And again, you certainly do have it, especially in river valley civilizations. And it may be a case where it's necessary to have large river valleys to really have the focus for larger states, or whether it's city states or whether you have these large territorial states like what you have in Egypt. Because there, what you do need to have is a kind of critical mass of population where you can get the rise of true cities. Because of course we do get the rise of substantial communities in some of these places like Çatalhöyük or Jericho, in Canaan, where you get these fortified towns, where the agriculture there is based on rain-watered crops in hill country, and they form true towns or small cities. But the population that's supported by this is not nearly what you could get in Mesopotamia or Egypt, or the Yellow River in China, or in the Indus Valley system, in what's now India and Pakistan, that are the first true great river valley civilizations, or some of the pre-Columbian civilizations you get, like the Inca and the Aztecs and the Maya. But those are where you have huge river valleys that allow for these huge cities to develop. In Egypt, you get a territorial state that's up and down the Nile River, whereas in Mesopotamia, you get a series of powerful city-states that are at odds with one another. And sometimes they create empires, but there's no great kingdom of Mesopotamia. It's a series of, city-sized miniature kingdoms that are always at war with one another.
Like the Mayans, it's not just one. Am I correct in that?
But I mean, either way, I think the thing that allows for this is not just. I mean, in Egypt, I mean, certainly the drawing up of the Sahara, the move to the Nile Valley, the formation of these agricultural communities that coalesce into state formation. And in the earliest phases of state formation, what sort of happens is, villages become towns. Some of the towns gain advantages, and they compete with one another until you get the coalescing in Upper Egypt of these proto-states. There are these three proto-states in Upper Egypt that coalesce around three major centers of Nagada, what becomes Abydos, and what becomes Hierakonpolis. and they coalesce into a single Upper Egyptian state, and then expands northwards into Lower Egypt, that finally around 3,300 BC then unifies all of the Egyptian Nile Valley into this territorial state that then arises with the Old Kingdom, beginning with the early dynastic period in the first dynasty, or actually even be in so-called Dynasty Zero, this period around 3,300 BC, that becomes the first territorial state in process of state formation, really.
Yeah. So, okay, great. You mentioned Mesopotamia and how they was different. Well, I'm reading the book, The Dawn of Everything, David Wingro. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, and David Graeber. It's a great work, and he talks about how in Mesopotamia they came to kingship it took them about 7,000 years, and in the archaeological record it shows like these mounds of actual, like, maybe what I want to say villages over time that they might be calling cities, but they're villages, and the villages died, and another one's over top of it. So these big mounds are formed. But when they went to eat, they tried to, in the early days, they tried to cookie cutter that and put that in the Nile Valley, and they just didn't have that. And what they found out in the Nile Valley was it was like maybe they had these summer camps, these mobile communities back and forth, and maybe they would have came to kingship and start over a 7,000 year period, maybe in 800, maybe it took them maybe 800 years to get the kingships, or basically it was a elimination of the kings in Africa as opposed to forming one king. Am I kind of right, or familiar with that?
I'm not sure. The thing is, I heard about this book and I started to read it, but I never really finished it. I know this particular guy takes a very sort of unorthodox or sort of dissenting view, that he's trying to challenge a lot of the conventional wisdom. So at one point I'm going to have to read it.
Yeah, you're going to read that.
I know he's not taking the party line view of these things, and I know there's been some criticism of his views. As far as what seems to happen, I think what you're alluding to is that in the earliest phases of people coming into the Nile Valley, before there was full settlement there, that in the earlier prehistoric period, when there was still a wet phase in the Sahara Desert, that it was more of, if you will, a swampy environment in the Nile Valley itself, and on the desert edge, which was then not quite so deserty, in the Nile Valley, people would sort of, on what was later sort of the desert edge, people would set up camps there, and so they would be there for part of the year. So there were sort of transitory settlements, but they weren't living there permanently. Right. And then gradually later you would actually begin to get more permanent settlement. And there are other places, I think, where this kind of thing happens, where, because we usually think of that either people are completely migratory or they're completely settled permanently in one place. Mm-hmm. But there are phases in early cultures where it's sort of half and half, where you get temporary encampments that are not just like a few days or weeks, but can last for months, or maybe even for a year or two, but they're not permanent settlements. But then people move on, or even that they recurrently, come to more or less the same place for a while and then move on, but then may come back later. So, so again, these things are a bit more complicated. Eventually, of course, people do move in and create these permanent agricultural settlements. And once you do get into agriculture where you're growing plants, then you are pretty much bound to the land. Now, one of the things about these more these temporary encampments that go on for a longer period of time, that may be more related to when you are relying on herding animals, and can have more long range. If there's enough foraging for your animals, where you don't have to constantly move on, but can camp for longer periods of times, but eventually do have to move on. One of the other things, and this was actually in Greece after the end of the Bronze Age, and that they found that sometimes people were moving around again herding animals. They weren't growing crops. And they were moving around, but that they had certain areas that they came back to, which were sometimes even based on former occupation sites, because they went there to bury their dead. So they had the communities themselves were mobile, but the necropolises, the burial grounds, were permanent places. And sometimes they were even buried on places that their ancestors had lived in, and where their dead were buried. And
that's
so,
interesting.
Yeah, so it's like the living moved around, but the dead stayed in one place, if you will.
Yeah. So Wingro, he actually talks about this.
Yeah.
No, go ahead. I don't want to cut you off.
No, that was basically it. That basically, when you're growing crops, you can't move around. You don't take your dead wandering around with you. And then if you rely on livestock, you stay or move depending on how much local feed there is for your animals. If there's a lot of feed and they don't, eat up all the local plant resources, then you don't have to move as often, because presumably you don't want to move any more than you need to. Now, again, if you're totally hunter-gatherer, as soon as you collect all the local food, then you have to move on. But presumably people don't want to necessarily move any more often than they have to, just to conserve energy. And if you set up, even if you have your tents and things with you, you don't have to constantly move around any more than is necessary. So I think nomadic, if you can stay in one place, you want to stay there as long as you can.
That's and I found that to be very, very interesting. I think one of those such sites of a mobile community would be Nabta Playa in Western Egypt. Nabta Playa talks about that, how the rituals and stuff was done maybe there, and then they moved on. But the thing that was very interesting to me when you talked about Greece, Wingro talks about down in Khatun, in those areas, that they have like these cities of the dead, meaning they burial sites. They have that these large areas of burial sites as they was being mobile. They had those burial sites. And that's interesting that you actually said they talked about that in Greece. And he says this is prior to even having cities, they would have these large cemeteries. That's very interesting. I appreciate your expert discourse on that right there. That's, man, it's been a pleasure, man. Like, the conversation will help work out a lot of things, at least for me in my studies and what I've been reading. And this information will definitely help us move forward in the community. I didn't expect it. You teaching.
Brian, you're a natural teacher, doctor. You're a natural.
You teaching. Yeah, natural. You teaching.
I want to it's interesting you bring up as Nabta Playa, because actually, and I just saw it because they moved it to the garden of the Nubian Museum in Aswan.
Okay.
It's really interesting to see, and they even set it in this little desert environment. But that actually reminds me of this famous, recently discovered thing in Turkey. This Göbekli Tepe. Which they think was again, it's so-called Turkish Stonehenge, that was used for something they think over 6,000 years. And I think Nabta Playa is a similar case, where essentially you have these holy sites that were used by, nomadic cultures, where again, very much like cemeteries, you can't move a holy site, and so you build a holy site, or you dedicate a holy site, and you go there whenever you need to use it, even though your lifestyle is mobile. This major religious site, just like your burial grounds, stay in one place, even though you don't live in one place. And so I think Nabata Playa was probably very much like this site, Göbekli Tepe, or however, I'm sorry, I'm butchering the
Belly Tepe.
And what's so interesting about the one in Turkey is that it was literally used, it now seems, for like 6,000 years, and was added to and refurbished and etc. for such a long time, during most of which, if not the entire period, people were not actually living. Oh, there's Khufu in the background. People weren't living in one place or in villages, but they were using this sacred place and as a stationary location. So again, it changes our whole view of how people lived. There were places they went to and stayed the same, even if their actual day-to-day lifestyle was rather mobile. And there was something in between, a mobile existence and a sedentary existence, even when they had sort of these semi-permanent or long-term encampments that wouldn't be permanent but weren't constantly moving either. Sort of long-term camps that were then eventually they moved on from.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna say thank you, Dr. Peter Brand, for joining us. You did a wonderful job today. You learned a lot. And I want to say thank you again, Ankh, for being a co-interviewer, our partner today. Thanks a lot.
Peter, I appreciate you coming through. Maybe we could do this again. Man, it was very, very enlightening. Detail and expertise that you brought to the conversation, and we'll all grow from this experience. Just having access to an academic and the person that actually works in the field, man, I think us as novice, we appreciate you and continue to teach. Thank you.
Well, I've enjoyed it too. I mean, usually just get to talk about Ramses, which I love to talk about, but this wide-ranging discussion about so many different things has been very stimulating. So thank you very much for this very diverse and interesting conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Cleared up a lot of things for me.